It's day one in Road America, and we are not talking about on track things once again. We're talking about off track things. And we're not talking about the podcast. We're talking about online hate, and drivers are now being pulled out of race cars. And at this time, it is Augustine Canapino, kind of the unthinkable yesterday. I even said, I couldn't really see a scenario in which Augustine Canapino would not be in a Juncos Hollinger car. And now all of a sudden, 90 minutes before the practice session began today at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, Augustine Canapino made the decision to step out of the Juncos Hollinger car, and Nolan Siegel parked his Indy Next car, jumped out of it, got a seat fit, got into the IndyCar, and began practicing for Juncos Hollinger Racing in the number 78 car. All the while, Romain Grosjean, the teammate, nosed it into the tire barrier very early on in the practice session. So one of the weirdest, like 2 hours for a team that I've ever seen. And I have a suspicion that this particular story is only just getting started. And really, it's a continuation of a story which started last year when there was some online things happening between Augustine Canapino, or perhaps more fittingly, fans of Augustine Canapino and Callum Ilott online. We saw this repeated with Théo Pourchaire, and now things have been liked on Twitter. Statements have been made, and Juncos and McLaren ended their partnership, which was a very bold move by McLaren, but one that I think was pretty popular online, considering the criticism of Canapino and Juncos for not addressing these things earlier and with more vigor. Well, now something has really kind of come down the pipeline that is quite significant, and it has happened in very rapid succession. So let's look at the statement released by Juncos Hollinger Racing, and we'll try to make some sense of exactly why this situation has happened. All right, so here is the statement released on the Juncos Hollinger Racing website. Nolan Siegel will be running in the number 78 entry in place of Augustine Canapino, who will be taking a leave of absence for this weekend's XPEL Grand Prix. The growth of online abuse and harassment resulting from the events of this week have led to a very difficult experience for Augustine, the team, and the entire IndyCar fan base. The safety of Augustine and the rest of the competitors has to be considered first and foremost. Abuse, hatred, harassment of any form is a detriment to this sport, and we must prioritize the mental and physical well-being of both of our drivers and our competition. Online abuse is unacceptable, and we need to ensure that our drivers are prepared both mentally and physically when they get into the car, said Brad Hollinger, co-owner of Juncos Hollinger Racing. We are saddened by the events that led to this scenario. Juncos Hollinger Racing is working directly with IndyCar to create a better community for our fans, drivers, team members, uniting to make IndyCar a welcome sport for all. So this press release is very interestingly worded, I would say, because even if I tuned in. I'm making this while practice is going on, by the way. So I tuned into the first 30 minutes of practice on Peacock, and there was talk about Augustine's mental health, specifically for him. And it's hard to kind of understand exactly why this decision was made. Was it Augustine's decision? Was it Brad Hollinger? This is the first time I can remember Brad Hollinger talking since I think they signed Callum Ilott. I mean, I cannot remember him talking to the media very much. And obviously this isn't talking to the media, but this is a press release statement. So I'm curious, because I saw some comments yesterday talking about what Brad thinks about this. Now, Brad Hollinger, if you don't know, was associated, if I remember correctly, with an A.J. Foyt entry at the Indy 500 a couple of years ago. He was also a major investor for a while in, I believe it was Williams Grand Prix racing. So he has been a major player in racing, and up until this point has been fairly silent on a lot of these issues. It's been mostly Ricardo Juncos who's been at the forefront. So it's interesting to see Brad at the forefront of this. There's a talk about, or there's the line about the safety of Augustine needs to be considered. So here's my speculation, or at least one potential theory, I think, is that from my understanding, Augustine was at the autograph session, which took place earlier today. And I'm curious if perhaps he got a sense there. Maybe this is the first time he's really faced significant backlash, like face to face, from some of this stuff. But I still don't think that that would be something that would necessitate. I mean, it would have to be, you'd have to hear something so heinous and putrid and just so unwelcoming that you would want to step out of the car. To me, this just seems like it's much deeper than this press release makes it out to be. And I'm curious as well, that the line at the end is interesting, which says Juncos Hollinger Racing is working directly with IndyCar to create a better community. Well, what does that mean? Was a suggestion from IndyCar to remove Augustine from the car? I'm curious about that as well. There's some things that, if you read between the lines of this press release, you can insinuate a whole lot. The problem is we don't have a lot of facts, and we're not going to have a lot of facts for a while. And now I wonder, okay, Nolan Siegel. Let's talk about this choice as well as for a driver. Now, presumably, he was one of the only licensed drivers on site to take a seat. I think that's the very first thing we have to think about, right? I mean, he almost, or I shouldn't say almost. I should say he was considered for the 17 car at the Indy 500 because he was the only licensed driver who wasn't currently assigned to a race car. Now, guys like Connor Daly, are they around at Road America this weekend? Are there other licensed drivers who could have theoretically taken this seat who don't currently have an Indy Next ride? Sure. Obviously, Nolan's raced in a road course this season, which probably puts him above other people. Was Tristan Vautier walking around? Nolan Siegel does have some connections to McLaren, which is interesting. The aforementioned 17 car and the potentiality of him driving that earlier this year. But also he's about to go race in the 24 Hours of Le Mans for United Autosports, which is partially owned by Zach Brown. So he's on that radar. And, of course, Tony Kanaan jumped on that pit box at one point to help out Nolan try to find some speed for the Indianapolis 500 earlier this year. So it's weird to see a driver, while not directly affiliated with McLaren, is close enough where he's jumping into the seat the day after McLaren and Juncos part ways. I think that's an interesting aspect to this as well. So now the question, I suppose, is, does Agustin Canapino return to this car? And if he does, when? And also, I need a better explanation as to exactly why. Did he receive threats, and were those credible? Like, yeah, some of this doesn't sit right with me because a lot of it doesn't make sense. And when it doesn't make sense, there's a reason for that, right? So this will continue to develop for sure. This was not the only news item that broke today. I suppose we'll briefly touch on this. This would have been the big story today, but obviously it's not anymore. That David Malukas will drive the number 66 Meyer Shank Racing car for the rest of this season. Now, there had been a couple of other names that had been floating around. In fact, I was pretty convinced until I wasn't that Hunter McElroy was going to be the driver who was going to get this ride. He was talked about quite a bit, but he ultimately did not get it. I got it from a very, very good source yesterday that David was the driver, and it turned out to be absolutely right. So you know who you are. Thank you very much for that bit of info. I kept it quiet. David Malukas, I think this is great for him. It's exactly the type of ride that he that I think he was looking for, because I got to speak to him briefly at Indy, and without going into super duper specifics about what we talked about, the impression I got from David was that he was not willing to take a ride that wasn't going to further his career. And so from this perspective, a ride opened up, which is potentially a very good one, a very strong car, a very strong team, good teammate with Felix Rosenqvist. So it makes a lot of sense for David to jump into this situation and it's the best opportunity for him to really get a sense of what he is capable of still in an IndyCar, and give him the best opportunity to show up and show out for the 2025 season. And a brief note as well, on the press release, it still mentions Tom Blomqvist at the very end, which says, Meyer Shank Racing thanks Tom Blomqvist for his efforts through the first 6 IndyCar events, and the Brit remains part of the MSR family. Meyer Shank Racing heads to the weekend, blah, 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 blah. Sorry, I thought there was more about Tom Blomqvist. But Blomqvist will most likely end up in a Meyer Shank Racing Acura in IMSA next year. So we'll have to wait and see exactly how that all plays out. Last I had kind of dug around in the rumor mill, it sounds like Meyer Shank Racing heading back to Acura in IMSA. The question mark, of course, is whether it's 1 or 2 cars. And if it's 2 cars, you've got a potential driver market there for other drivers. And if it's not 2 cars, who gets the second Acura would be the next question. A name that has been thrown around a couple of times is Chip Ganassi Racing. So for those of you who are interested in sports cars, and of course you should be because it's the week before the 24 Hours of Le Mans, there's a little bit of insight. So yeah, what a freaking day. What a weird day. What an odd day. But here we are. Thank you guys so much for watching. More coverage throughout this weekend. As things break, we'll see you in the next video.